We're talking today about Christianity. I'm going to introduce the topic. This is going to be a topic that we break up into a lot of different videos, from the life of Jesus to the significance of the life of Jesus and the death of Jesus to the significance of the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus, of course, being the central figure, the most central figure in Christianity. We're going to talk about the history of the church. We're going to talk about various disputes that occurred within the church, and theological disputes included. So in this first video, we're going to talk about Jesus. We're going to give a basic timeline of his life. And we're going to talk about two parallels that especially the Gospel of Matthew highlights in Jesus' life. That is a parallel with Israel and a parallel with Moses. Now, that doesn't exhaust all of what's going on in Matthew. The more you read these Gospels and the New Testament in general, what the Christians call the New Testament, the more you see the richness of the narratives and the sort of allusions that are being made. That's allusions with an A, not an I. The sort of references that are being made to the Hebrew Bible and to Israel's history, etc. But we're just going to tap into two of the big ones today. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go ahead and start the full slideshow. Okay, so we're talking about Christianity. This is an icon of Jesus from the Eastern Orthodox Church in the background here. We'll talk about what the Eastern Orthodox Church is later. It's you could call it a denomination. It's one of the Christian churches. All right, so here's sort of the basics of Jesus's life. On the right-hand side, I have a picture that was sort of, computer generated relatively recently. It was many people's. I don't want to take a stance on how accurate it may be or how accurate the research it was based on would be, but it's sort of a more realistic portrayal. According to the people who made it, it's supposed to be a more realistic portrayal of what Jesus would have looked like. All right, so we have lots of the white blonde Jesuses in churches in Texas, at least. And this is sort of, I guess, meant to kind of counteract that sort of portrayal of Jesus. Not that it's necessarily bad, right? Because you have portrayals, you have Black portrayals of Jesus, you have Asian portrayals of Jesus. People depict Jesus as representing them, and that's not necessarily bad. That's sort of part of the Christian narrative. In fact, as we'll see, is that Jesus is for all people, initially for Israel, and then eventually for all people in the Christian narrative. Okay, so here are the basic facts of his life. He was born about 4 BC. We can kind of be, we're not exactly sure. Now, again, this is all going to be, I'm not saying one way or another whether the narrative is true, but this is all on the Christian narrative, right? I'm not going to ask whether these facts are actually accurate. They may be, they may not be, as far as what I'm going to say here goes, but here's what Christians say about Jesus. Some of this can be historically confirmed, but really, first and foremost, we're talking about the Christian narrative. So he was born to a virgin, Mary. She was very young, and she was engaged to Joseph when she became pregnant. She did not become pregnant by Joseph or any other human man, right? On the Christian narrative is the Holy Spirit, which is one of the persons of God. That gets pretty crazy too. There's a lot that goes into this, but basically the basics of this is that Mary became pregnant with Jesus, not by the insemination of any human male, really not by insemination at all. An angel came to her and said, "You're going to have a baby. You should call him Jesus." Jesus was born. We don't really know much about his life prior to his public ministry. There's one story about him when he was young in one of the Gospels. The Gospels are the 4 books written about Jesus' life and death and its significance. There's one story about him hanging out in the temple, and that's it. That's really it. And unless you want to go to less historically accredited stories or narratives of Jesus' life, which were probably written long after the actual 4 Gospels were written. But he started his public ministry as an adult. He was, probably in his early 30s. He had 12 disciples or apostles, And that means those were like his closest followers who he divulged most to and shared most of his life with. But he had a lot more followers than that. You can see this in narratives like the Sermon on the Mount, when and then narratives about him like feeding the 5,000. And again, the 5,000 there that he feeds are there to listen to him, and the 5,000 is a count of the men in the group, when they probably were also bringing many of them had their families with them, so it would have been far more than 5,000. Okay, so he was an itinerant preacher. During his ministry, he would travel all around Israel preaching, miraculously healing people. He would focus mostly on the poor and the sick, the oppressed and the sinners, so to speak. So he was always getting in trouble with the Jewish authorities. Oh, my bad. I don't know what just happened there. Let me restart our slideshow. So he was always getting in trouble with a lot of the Jewish authorities for hanging out with the unclean. So this is not an aspect of Judaism that we went in super depth about, but we did talk about the various laws that governed Jewish life. And a lot of it, we said, had to do with ritual purity, right? So you couldn't touch, certain things. You couldn't eat certain things. You couldn't do certain things. You couldn't be around certain people. And to put it briefly, Jesus really didn't care about that. So he violated lots of the ritual purity stuff. He was around lepers. He would cleanse lepers, actually. He would eat with sinners, tax collectors. Tax collectors were people in Israel who really did not have a good reputation because they were collecting taxes on behalf of the Romans. So a little bit of history behind this is that the Romans had conquered Israel prior to this. Before the Romans had conquered Israel, they had been conquered by the Seleucids. That was when, we've talked about this very briefly when we were talking about Judaism. That's when the Maccabean revolt happened, and that's where Hanukkah comes from. But their overlords were the Romans at this time, during Jesus' time. For the entirety of his life, the Romans were in charge, and the Romans ultimately killed him. But the tax collectors were collecting taxes on behalf of the Romans. They were collecting money from Jews to give to Romans. And so you can imagine that a lot of Jews were not really happy about that. And he hung out with them too. He hung out with people who were sick, people who were impure. There's a story about him healing a woman who had a disease that caused her to bleed, which, again, that was one of the things that would make you ritually impure as a woman. And he didn't worry about that. The interesting that does not mean that he was necessarily breaking the purity laws according to Judaism, because what happened was actually at least in the Christian narrative, is a reversal of what was supposed to happen. You were supposed to avoid these sources of impurity within Judaism because they would make you unclean. Now, what Jesus wasn't doing was he was saying, oh, that's all stupid. All of the Jewish law is stupid, and I'm not going to keep it. In fact, he said that he came to fulfill the law, not to break it or to do away with it. But what happened is, and what the Gospels present as the narrative of what was going on with Jesus was, instead of, these were real sources of impurity, but instead of the impurity infecting Jesus, the purity went from Jesus and did away with the impurity, right? So the woman stopped bleeding. The lepers stopped being sick. Leprosy, if you don't know, is a skin disease, right? It's not denying the reality of the laws or the sort of sources of purity and impurity. In fact, Matthew is writing from a very Jewish perspective. Matthew is one of the gospel writers. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But what's going on here is the impurity of these people is granted or assumed. And what's supposed to happen on the Jewish understanding, and what normally does happen, and what the writers of the Gospels are assuming happens, is that impurity causes those who come in contact with it to become impure. But instead, what happens with Jesus is that it's the same thing coming. A person who's pure comes in contact with someone impure, and in normal circumstances, the impurity would infect the pure, but instead, the purity is following back up and defeating the impurity in Jesus's case. So his purity is not overcome by the impurity, and it actually causes the impurity to go away. Okay, so he came into conflict with the Jewish authorities for a number of reasons. there were a bunch of different groups in Israel at the time, kind of vying for authority, whether religious or political authority. But so he came into conflict with different groups for different reasons. But his public ministry lasted for about 3 years. There was always a lot of tension between him and the authorities. And eventually they conspired to have him killed, right? So the Jews did not have the authority to kill or to execute someone because they were not given that authority by the Romans. The Romans, remember, were in charge. The Romans said, y'all don't get to execute somebody. You can run your own little courts and punish people for other stuff, but you don't get to kill people. So when it came time for the Jewish authorities to try to trump up some charge against Jesus, they had to basically make it look like he was doing something that the Romans didn't want the Jews to do. And what they framed him as was a Jewish insurrectionary. Is that a word? Insurrectionist? Yeah, a rebel. Someone who was trying to overthrow the Roman government. There were lots of movements like that in Jesus' time. Prior to Jesus' time, multiple people had already been put to death. In fact, multiple men who had claimed to be the Messiah had been, or at least one, I'm not sure if there were multiple, but at least one man had come before him claiming to be the Messiah, as Jesus claimed to be. But that man claimed to be a political Messiah. The Jews were all expecting their Messiah, the person who came in to save them, to be a political Messiah, to be someone who came in and threw off the yoke of Roman overlordship. And there had been people who came in and claimed to be that. There had been rebellions against Rome prior to Jesus's day, before he was born, not long before he was born, and they were put down very violently. And so the Romans were kind of on guard for Jews who were trying to overthrow them or claiming to be Messiah. And so when it came time for them to frame Jesus, the Jewish authorities, that is, they framed him as a revolutionary, as a rebel trying to lead a rebellion against Rome. And then he was ultimately killed. He was arrested and tortured and then crucified. Crucifixion, if you don't know, is a kind of barbaric form of killing / torturing, where you hang someone on a cross and they die for a number of reasons. Why they die differs by person, right? But you can die from blood loss. You usually don't, because you have nails put through your hands or your wrists and then through your feet. You're not going to lose a lot of blood that way. If you've been tortured a lot beforehand, you can die of blood loss. But ultimately, you can die of asphyxiation, because you're hanging there, and in order to have your lungs not collapse or your diaphragm not collapse, again, I'm not a doctor, but this is my understanding, you have to push yourself up with your legs, right? You're using your leg strength to push up off those nails that are nailed through your feet into the wood on the cross, and hold yourself up so that you can breathe. But eventually, especially with no food and no water, those muscles are going to get tired, and you're going to get tired, and you're going to have to rest and not breathe. And then you'll be able to push yourself up, and then you have to rest a little bit, and you can push yourself up. But eventually those muscles are just going to give out, and you're going to suffocate. Jesus actually died earlier than average for a crucifixion. It only took him a few hours on the cross to die. And many times people would live for days on the cross, right? Kind of amazing what your muscles can do if the other option is death. And so that was sort of by design, that people would live for a while. It was to put people up on a cross by the Romans was not just a means of torturing and executing that person. It was a way of intimidating anyone who would try to do what those people did. So they would put crosses up by roadsides where lots of people walked, and that person would be hanging on the cross alive for the first few days, and then they would leave them dead after that as sort of a warning. Okay, Jesus was killed on Passover, or during the Passover season, and he was killed on a Friday. That's why Christians celebrate Good Friday now. And then Sunday was resurrected on the Christian narrative, miraculously. It's not like he didn't actually die on the cross. That's not part of the Christian narrative, that he just fell asleep or something, or he went unconscious, but he still had some life in him, and then he woke up in the tomb. On the Christian story, he actually did die, and then he was miraculously raised from the dead on that Sunday. Okay, so what he has claimed to be and what he claimed to be himself was the Messiah, that is the Savior that the Jews had been waiting for thousands of years, that was prophesied in lots of the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. Like I said, he turned out to be a Messiah. If he was the Messiah, he was a very different kind of Messiah than the Jews were expecting. They were expecting a political Messiah who would defeat all of their enemies and establish the reign of God conclusively on the earth. And Jesus did not do that. In fact, he preached nonviolence. He claimed to be, and Christians claimed him to be the Son of God and to be fully God and fully human. So it's actually really important, as we'll kind of touch on, but not much, but we'll just touch on it a little bit now. It's really important to Christian theology that he be both fully God and fully human, right? Because, well, we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about atonement. But those are the sort of basics of his life. We went into a lot of backstory there about Rome and Israel and all this other stuff, but those are the basics and the bullet points. Okay, let's talk real quick about two of the big important parallels that the Gospel of Matthew highlights in Jesus's life. Okay, so Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, there are 4 Gospels. One is written by Matthew, and Matthew's Gospel is written, most people think is very clearly written for a Jewish audience. Matthew is highlighting, and the other Gospels are not like this, at least not to the same extent. Matthew is highlighting aspects of Jesus's life and ministry that would be especially interesting to Jews, that would be especially kind of salient to Jews. Okay, so one of the big parallels is that Jesus' life kind of maps on with the history of Israel, or with the big events in the history of Israel. So let me talk about Israel for a second. We touched on a lot of this when we talked about Judaism, but the history of Israel, again, we're covering hundreds of years here, but they originally went to Egypt to avoid a famine. Egypt was not their native land, but they went there to avoid a famine. This is the story of Jacob and his sons. They go to Egypt to avoid famine. They're eventually enslaved there. Pharaoh, one of the pharaohs starts to get kind of worried that they're getting too many Jews there, so he kills all the male infants. That's when Moses, that's the sort of prelude to Moses' story. He is one of the male infants who gets saved by his family, hidden in a river, or in a basket in a river. And eventually Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt, and he saves them by God saves them by leading them through the Red Sea. Moses parts the waters of the Red Sea by God's power, and they walk through, and Pharaoh and his armies, the Pharaoh of Egypt and his armies, come chasing after the Jews. And as the Jews come out of the Red Sea, the Egyptians go into the Red Sea between the parted waters, and then the waters collapse on them and they die. Okay, so they come out, they're free out of Egypt, and then, long story short, they spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness. Moses was supposed to lead them to the promised land. God had promised to bring them to this land of milk and honey that was supposed to be a place of good fruitfulness, of flourishing for them. That was the promise, but they sinned. They were exiled for 40 years in the wilderness before they could enter the promised land. And eventually they go in to the promised land after those 40 years. Now, here's one other salient fact about Israel before we work through the parallels. There were 12 tribes of Israel. Go figure, right? I can't name them all off the top of my head. I don't have them written down here. The Levites were the priestly tribe. They did not, but the other 11 tribes had a territory. The Levites did not have a territory. They were the priests, and they were kind of scattered through the tribes. But the other 11 tribes, Judah, Benjamin, oh gosh, now I'm starting to blank, had territories. Okay, but there were 12 tribes. Now, let's look at Jesus. As Matthew tells the story, there is an alarm. It's very clear as he tells the story of Jesus that he's trying to highlight parallels between Jesus and Israel. And we'll talk about why he would want to do that in just a minute. But Jesus, when he was born, he was a baby, his parents fled with him to Egypt because Herod was doing the same thing that Pharaoh had done. He was killing all the male children in Bethlehem because he had heard that there was a child born there that would be the Messiah. Now, this goes back to what we were just saying. If you're a Jew at that time, and Herod was at least nominally a Jew, you think that Messiah means someone who's going to take political control. And if you're Herod, backstory, Herod is a political ruler, a Jewish political ruler. So he's sort of like a governor. He does not have authority over Rome. Rome has authority over him, but they're allowing him to rule. Rome kind of realized that things would go better with the Jews if they let them have their own little regional Jewish ruler, with the Romans ultimately in charge. But they kind of realized after all of these attempted rebellions, things will go better if we play it a little looser with the Jews. Let them have their governor, kind of keep our hands out of things, and things were a little quieter after that. So Herod was that regional Jewish ruler. So if you're that guy and you hear about a Messiah coming, being born in Bethlehem, that was the prophecy about Jesus, then you're nervous because he's going to wrest control from you. Okay, so he had all the male children killed in the area of Bethlehem in the Gospel of Matthew. Okay, so there's two parallels already. Both Israel and Jesus go to Egypt to avoid dying. Both Israel and Jesus, have, in both cases, there's a mass killing of infants of Israelites by a ruler, a political ruler. Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River by a guy named John the Baptist. The Jordan River flows into the Red Sea. So you get the Sea of Galilee up here and the Jordan River coming down into the Red Sea. So the Israelites are saved by going through the Red Sea. There you could say that they were baptized in the Red Sea. Baptism is just the dunking under water. Jesus baptized in a river that flows into the Red Sea. The Israelites spent 40 years in the wilderness. Jesus spent 40 days fasting in the wilderness before he started his public ministry. This was a time when he fasted, he prayed a lot, and he was tempted by Satan. And similarly, Jesus picked out 12 disciples, just like there are 12 tribes of Israel. So it's abundantly clear when you read these first chapters of Matthew that Matthew is trying to highlight these parallels between Jesus and Israel. Now, the next question is, why is he doing that? Why is that an important thing to highlight for Matthew? So we're approaching the Gospel of Matthew as a piece of literature here. We're asking why he would think that that was important to highlight in the narrative. Why is he showing us how Jesus and Israel are the same? Here's a theory. It's not really a theory. This is pretty clearly what's going on in Matthew. Matthew is trying to show us that Jesus is the new Israel. So let me step back for a minute. We talked about this when we talked about Judaism. The history of Israel in the Hebrew Bible is a history of a group of people who were initially chosen to be God's special people who would bring blessing to the entire world. It's the history of that people failing God and failing to keep his law. Let's take one step back even further. Why was Israel chosen to be that special people? That was never part of the original plan. Remember, in the Garden of Eden, God meant for all humanity to be in this special relationship with him. He told Adam and Eve they were the only people, be fruitful and multiply, and he was going to be interacting with them. And God was literally living in the garden at that time. And people were supposed to be, remember, joining with God in the ordering work that he had already started. So they were supposed to continue to spread the Garden of Eden. It was local. They were supposed to continue to spread the order of the Garden of Eden to the whole world. That was what God meant when he said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. And then what happened? Well, they rebelled, they sinned by taking themselves as an authority rather than submitting themselves to the authority of God in terms of how they ought to live their lives. And what happened after that was kind of the spiraling down of humanity. Things just got worse and worse and worse until God said, you know what? I'm going to pick a remnant. I'm going to destroy everything and pick a remnant. So he did that with Noah. He destroyed humanity, picked Noah to be a remnant that he saved, and he would restart there. And then people screwed up again. And then he picked Abraham. Eventually, he picks all of Israel, and he says, look, people keep screwing up, keep screwing up. I'm going to pick another remnant, that is Israel. I'm going to be your special God. I'm going to invest in you. You'll be my chosen people. He makes a covenant with them. We talked about that, the notion of covenant. You keep my law, and I will bless you and bless the world through you. So the ultimate goal, zooming back out, was to use Israel to get back to blessing and fruitfulness for the whole of humanity. That was the ultimate goal. That was the original project. All of humanity was going to be blessed by being in relationship with God and spreading his order in the world. There was rebellion and sin. And then he said, I'm going to use this group of people to get that back. I'm going to use this group of people. They'll be my special people. They'll keep my law. I'll bless them. And ultimately, I'll work to where we get all of humanity back. And it didn't work. Why did it not work? Because Israel kept screwing up in the way that all of humanity was screwing up from basically the start of creation. So what Matthew is telling us here, to get back to this focal point, is Israel didn't do what they were supposed to do. They did not do what they were supposed to do. They were supposed to keep God's law, and by keeping God's law, bring all of humanity back into communion with God and back into the work that they were meant to do with God. They were supposed to be an image of God in the sense of God created order out of chaos. Now you humans, you go create order out of chaos, spread and bring order to all the world. They didn't do that. Israel did not complete their mission of helping humanity get back to that place of communion with God and order in the world. And so what Matthew is telling us here is that Israel has failed in a way that cannot be undone, and Jesus is going to be the new Israel that actually does what Israel was supposed to do originally. Jesus is going to be the new Israel, the person that does what Israel was supposed to do originally. And what was that? By keeping the law, to bring blessing to all of humanity and to bring humanity back into communion with God, where their communion had been cut off and they had spiraled down in sin and further sin. Okay, hold that in your head for a little while. Jesus, here's the lesson of all of that, all of that background. Jesus is supposed to be the new Israel. And what that means is he's supposed to do what Israel was supposed to but did not do. That is, bring humanity back into where they were supposed to be, communion with God and imaging God in creation. Okay, that's clearly one thing that's going on in the Gospel of Matthew. Here's a second thing. After this, we'll end this video and start a new one. Matthew is also presenting Jesus as a parallel to Moses. So let's walk through another set of parallels. Moses, if you've seen the old Charlton Heston movie, you know this. He was the one who brought the 10 Commandments down from the mountain from God. He went up to the top of the mountain. He communed with God. It was a long time. He actually saw God, or kind of saw the back of God, and his face shone. And when he came back down to the Israelites with the 10 Commandments, they could see he was shining because he had been in communion with God. He was also the person before that who had parted the Red Sea. Obviously, we already talked about that, brought the Israelites out of Egypt. And then after the Israelites rebelled and they were condemned to being 40 years in the wilderness, he, by God's power, by praying to God, brought manna and quail. Manna is a kind of bread. Quail, obviously, is a kind of bird. God sent, in response to his prayer, manna and quail to sustain the Israelites in the wilderness, and he gave so much that they always had leftovers, tons of leftovers. There was a point at which a bunch of Israelites got bit by snakes, and he, by God's direction, held a pole on it that had a snake wrapped around it, and by, looking at it, the Israelites were saved from the effects of the snake bite. Moses also, in trying to get the Israelites out of Egypt, brought all these different plagues onto Egypt, because the Pharaoh of Egypt at the time would not let the Israelites leave. And so God, via Moses, sent all of these different plagues on Egypt to try to get Egypt to let the Israelites leave. And one of them was turning the water in the Nile River, which flows through Egypt, into blood. That was one of the plagues, right? And that's horrible because that's your water, right? And blood is not something you want to drink or put on your crops. So those are lots of different aspects of Moses and his life and how he led the Israelites, kind of put there just on the screen. But what Matthew is doing is showing that Jesus actually does a bunch of the same stuff or similar stuff. So Jesus, in his most famous sermon called the Sermon on the Mount, it's called the Sermon on the Mount because it was on, well, kind of a mountain, a raised area. It's not really a mountain. But he gives 10-ish beatitudes from a mountain, just like Moses gave 10 commandments from a mountain. There's a moment in Jesus' ministry where he takes a couple of the disciples up and he's transfigured again on a mountain. He goes up on a mountain and he's transfigured to where they can see his divinity, his godlikeness, and he shines just like Moses shone, or shined, I think it's shone, after seeing God and coming down off the mountain. Jesus, at one point, when he's in a boat with his disciples, he's out on this boat in the Sea of Galilee. It's this little, relatively small body of water compared to the Red Sea. There's a big storm, and he's asleep in there, and they wake him up. They think they're all going to die, and he, calms the waters. He makes the storm go away. Well, like we said, the Sea of Galilee flows into the Red Sea. So just like Moses parted the Red Sea, exercised control over the waters, Jesus is exercising control over essentially the same waters. And just as Moses, by God's power, brought manna and quail from heaven, Jesus, in one episode, he's preaching to all these people, 5,000 people, and there's no food. They need to be fed. And he takes, these 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, I think, and he multiplies them so that it feeds all of the thousands of people there with a bunch of leftovers. They collect a bunch of leftovers. Jesus was raised up on a pole, so to speak, the cross, to save the Israelites, just like Moses raised up a pole with a snake on it to save the Israelites. And remember, in the Genesis narrative, sin ultimately comes from a serpent. So Jesus, in raising himself up on a pole so that anyone who looks to him can be saved from the effects of a serpent. And finally, Jesus, just like Moses turned water into blood, Jesus turns water into wine in the first miracle that he performs in his public ministry. Okay, so lots of parallels with Moses. And again, we can ask ourselves, look, we just got into the nitty-gritty, into the details. We can ask ourselves, why is Matthew, it's very clear that Matthew is trying to highlight these parallels with Moses, right? It's not to say they didn't happen. He's not making it up, but he's presenting these facts in a way to show the reader. I mean, he's not saying it. He's not saying, hey, Jesus is the new Moses. Jesus is the new Moses. But he's showing us very clearly that Jesus, in some way, is a Moses figure. And it's pretty clear, and what most scholars think here is that what he's doing, he's trying to show people Jesus is the new Moses. He is a Moses figure. Well, what does that mean? Well, what role did Moses play in relation to the Israelites? The answer is that he was a leader, and more importantly, he was an intercessor. He was the person who stood between Israel and God and was a mediator. He stood between Israel and God, conveyed Israel's desires to God and God's desires to Israel, and without whom Israel could have never lived or flourished or had the relationship with God that they had. That's the long and short of it. And so what Matthew is telling us here in drawing these parallels is that Jesus is an even more perfect mediator or intercessor. He is going to come between Israel and ultimately humanity and God and bridge the gap in the way that Moses did. And so that we can have a full, true relationship with God in a way that we couldn't before. Okay, so that's the big point of drawing all of these parallels. Okay, we're going to stop here. We're going to break this up. And next we're going to talk about sort of the big level significance of Jesus's life and death and resurrection.